Well, welcome to the Writer Reads Planet's Ransom, Book 1 of the Ransomeers series. This is Chapter 6, Survival Training. You have 6 hours of daylight left, the computer reminded me, and the breeze touched my skin again. How do I secure the pod while I'm out? I asked. I was torn between getting the campfire started and exploring my surroundings. Just say, pod close, the computer replied. And to get back in? Say pod open. Your voice pattern is on file. I tried it before leaving the shelter. Pod close, I said, and the touch of wind on my face ceased. Pod open, and once more the wind blew. I decided I'd do the cooking fire first. After all, I had to keep the dratted thing going for 5 days in order to progress. And that was when I remembered that I had no idea what a Vuran bush or Tamska tree looked like. I went back to the computer, touched the survival square and looked for a clue. Nothing doing, just the fire icon at the bottom of the page. I touched it again, bracing myself for the sting of pain I'd felt before, and very relieved when it didn't happen a second time. Rereading the How to Build a Cooking Fire entry did nothing to help me identify the bushes or trees I needed to find, so I closed the fire and survival windows and stared at the screen, and that was when I remembered the xenobiology database. Hitting the bush icon and typing in Vuran gave me a picture of the bush and a description of where I was likely to find it. The Tamska tree looked vaguely familiar, so I glanced outside again. Yep, I'd landed right next to a cluster of 3 or 4. Fine, I thought, and wondered if this was just a coincidence or deliberate. There was no way I was going to ever find that out, so I just accepted it for the gift it was and closed the screen. Cool. Gathering enough bark to start the fire didn't take long. I stacked it on the ground next to the metal flooring and remembered that the instruction had advised enclosing an area in stone to store the firewood and other materials. I made a note to get started on that right after I'd found the Vuran bush, and that was going to take a bit more effort than just stepping off my front porch. Pod close, I ordered, after I'd settled the pack on my back and picked up the hatchet. At the same time, I lowered the visor on the GGS and a whole new world opened up before me. Or rather, part of a whole new world. GGS my grandmother's behind, I thought, reaching out to lean on the pod while my eyes adjusted to looking through the visor as well as looking at what was on it. The visor took me beyond what I could see, giving me a green-lined map and showing me my location in relation to the pod. There were a bunch of lines that meant nothing to me, although I noticed a whole bunch of them came pretty close together just beyond the ridge of trees outside the pod. Curious, I walked over to take a look and stopped dead. The pod was sitting on a shelf, and below the trees the hill was so steep it was almost a cliff. Looking cautiously over, I could see the tufty bushes and scraggly trees clinging to the ground, but the angle was too steep to walk down without risking a fall. I looked up past the pod. The lines of the map were a lot further apart that way. It was hard to tell through the trees, but it looked like the slope wasn't as steep. I decided it might be a good idea to go up instead of down. Maybe there'd be an easier path to the river I could see marked at the bottom of the hill. I tried to remember where the Vuran bushes grew, exposed hillsides, like the one I'd seen below the pod. Fantastic. Thank you, you scaly monsters. Thank you very much. Still, maybe there'd be more exposed slopes closer to the top. I checked the map for more lines drawing closer together. Looked like I was right. All I had to do was make it to the top of the ridge and walk a little way along it. I scanned the ground around the pod, looking for a path through the trees, but the only path I could see was the one the pod had gouged into the hillside. I made a note of that for later. If my pod had left such a big mark, then someone else's pod would have done the same, and they might have dropped us apart, but they'd done it in the same area. Maybe I'd be able to see another pod mark from the top. Without thinking any more about it, I shouldered the pack and climbed out of the ditch, using one of the Tamskas to pull myself up. The ground underfoot was covered in leaves and some sort of flattish bush. I was glad the visor was filming it. Maybe I'd be able to use the footage to identify the animals and plants I needed to know about for the xenobiology task. Animals. The thought of them made me stop and take a closer look around me. The computer had said this was not a benign world, not safe, and I was leaving the pod behind without any way of protecting myself. That made me stop and think some more. I looked around and realized that for an area with a lot of trees, there weren't a lot of twigs on the ground. There certainly weren't any of the bigger sticks that I was looking for. I guess it was a good thing I had the hatchet then. I hefted it in one hand and started moving forward, using the markers in the visor to make sure I kept going up. It was weird. I kept walking up, moving around bushes and ducking under branches, and the ground didn't always look like I was going up. Sometimes it dipped into a hollow or shallow gully, and I found myself going down a little ways. If it hadn't been for the map, I'd have thought I was going down the other side of the hill. In the end, I needn't have worried. The higher I went, the further apart the trees got, until I could see a ridge of hill that had no more hill above it. It was exciting and disappointing all at once. Exciting to have reached the top of the hill, but disappointing because the trees still grew thick enough to stop me from seeing too far ahead. What I needed was some kind of lookout or something. I walked along the ridgeline, heading toward one of those spots where the lines on the map drew closer together. I noticed that the ground got steeper as they did, and that the trees were smaller. The tamskas gave way to something else, a stunty kind of tree with thorn-like spines forming ridges in its bark. The visor screen flared red when I looked at the first one. Red, huh? Well, if there was one thing I had learned, the colors for danger hadn't changed much between civilizations. Even the Evernatch put red on their warning signs. Bright colors on most worlds mean danger, the instructor had explained. We have noticed this is true for your Earth, just as it is for Evern. Earth. The memory made me catch my breath and my eyes prickle. Stop it, I told myself. Stop it, stop it, stop it. There would be time to cry later, like later when I was safely back in the pod. And blurry vision didn't mean I could miss seeing something that might want to eat me. In the meantime, I'd better remember to look the thorny trees up when I got back. It struck me then that the computer hadn't given me either the pistol promised or a medical kit. Too bad if I hurt myself today, then, isn't it? I thought, and wondered how the others were doing. Mitch was bound to be okay, as were any of the other soldier boys, but I didn't know how Sue Lynn or Alicia or even Davo would handle it. And I have to admit, that worried me. I had to find them. We'd do better than alone. If I hurt myself now, how was I going to get back to the pod? Who would come and help me if I just couldn't make it? I just didn't know. And maybe I just should be keeping my mind on the job. I turned my attention back to the thornies. Just in time. There was something moving along the branches of the nearest one. Several somethings, a whole ton of somethings. In fact, at first I thought they were ants or bees or wasps or something, but then I realized they were much, much worse. Spiders, or scorpions, both. As I stood there, the creatures moved along the branch and started coming down the trunk. I took a step back and saw the swarm hesitate. When I stopped, it started moving again. I took another step back and then took a look over my shoulder. It would be just my luck to run into another thorny trying to get away from this one. No, this time my luck was holding. This time I had a clear line of retreat to the trees. I took it, careful not to stumble in my slow progress backward, more relieved than I cared to admit when the tide of tail-waving eight-legged monster bugs stopped and slowly retreated back into the thorn tree's branches. So much for my plan of searching for Vuran bushes in the exposed area. I stood still and watched as the swarm vanished back inside the thorns, and then I studied the rest of the narrow-lined area. The steep part of the hill had no tamska trees on it, but it did have small groves of the short and stunty thorn trees interspersed by big round tussocks of a gingery kind of grass, and smaller purple-leaved bushes that grew as tall as my waist. Vurans. I glared at them, and then I took another look. The spider scorpions hadn't come out of the thorns until I'd gotten real close to the thorn tree. Maybe there was a way to get to a Vuran bush without getting too close to the thornies? My heart sank just a little. How was I going to work out exactly how close I could get to a thorny without getting bit? Using the visor, I scanned the steeper slope for more danger, and I was pretty glad to notice that the only things outlined in red were the thorn bushes. Fine. There was only one way I could think of that would let me work out how close I could get. I sure wished the visor had a zoom lens because I really wanted to focus on the thorns. That way I'd be able to see the first sign of movement and know I'd reached the limit. Zoom, I muttered. Then, close up. But nothing happened, and I gave it up as a bad joke. Either the visor didn't have that function built into it, or I didn't have access. Given how the computer had responded so far, I was willing to bet it was the latter. Fine, I muttered, and focused on the nearest thorn tree. As it was, I didn't end up needing the close-up function after all. The scorpion spiders put on quite a warning display if you knew what to look for. Turns out the red flashes on the thorn trees weren't just the visor. The spider scorpions raised their front legs, flashing the underside of their thoraxes, and I do mean flashing. As I got closer to the tree, 3 or 4 of the creatures would emerge and spread out around their thorn, and then they'd begin this bobbing dance that showed their undersides. I'd been so busy looking at the visor the first time round that I'd completely missed the reality. I caught it now. The second the dance started, I took a step back and watched the bugs stop dancing. I took another step back, and they clustered close to their thorns, turning their bodies to watch me as I walked past, keeping my distance. Once I'd passed out of range, they scuttled back inside their thorn. Right, I said, and picked out a clump of vuran bushes that looked like it was at the right distance from all the nearest thorn trees. Before I started walking toward it, I used the visor to scan the path I planned to take. Only when nothing turned red did I move over to the vuran, trying to remember just how much of it I needed to get the cook fire started. If I remember rightly, I could take just one bush and that would be enough to get things going. I took 3, and then decided to get it back to the pod for safekeeping. I had to build the fire pit, and I was going to need something bigger to keep the fire burning right through the night. Going back through the trees, I noticed that everything seemed a lot darker than on the way up. I glanced at the sky and realized my trek up the hill had taken longer than I thought, and I hadn't done anywhere near as much as I wanted to. Man, I hadn't even found another landing scar, and I really, really didn't want to spend the night alone. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, please hit like. If you want to see more, please hit subscribe, and I'll check you later. Take care out there.